Start. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll open up with a word of prayer and we'll dive right in. God, we are grateful for this opportunity to gather together once again, and we're thankful that you give us these wonderful and challenging texts to struggle with, to think about, and to be shaped by. And I pray that that would indeed be what happens tonight. And we pray all these things in your Son's name. Amen. Yep, come on in, guys. We may have to get some more chairs. I don't think they gave me enough. So let me get my keys. Yeah, if we need. We also have. Yeah, let me get another table. There's another table as well. He didn't know. I usually put one over here. And if we need any more chairs.
Lucky we didn't have to.
Somebody else comes in, you just have to put a chair.
We're lucky to get a chair. We're lucky we're not standing for the whole class.
Okay, all right. So did everybody get a chance to read, kind of read through Jonah? If you haven't had a chance, then please do that. If you missed last week and you want to go back and watch last week, the video is on YouTube. If you didn't get the links or anything like that, it's pretty easy. Just go do Leon Bloater, and I have a channel, and it's going to be on my channel, right? So it's just kind of easy to do that as well. There'll also be like 5 million church announcements, stupid videos I've made. Hopefully nothing terrible. All right, so first of all, what I want to do is I want to find out if there's any lingering questions that anybody might have from last week, or any questions that people had as you were reading, and maybe if you watched the video or didn't watch the video and were reading, or you just have questions. So Deb.
Yeah, chapter 1, verse 16, this is after they, took Jonah up and cast him forth into the sea. It says, then the men feared the Lord exceedingly and offered a sacrifice unto the Lord and made vows. So this whole thing really affected these people.
It did. So what Deb was saying, for those who may not be able to hear, and for all of you, is in verse 16 of chapter 1, after the sailors throw Jonah overboard, the wind and the storm calms, and so then they fear the Lord, right? So that was the first thing that you saw, was that they feared the Lord, and then they offered sacrifice. So we did touch on that, but we kind of went through it pretty quickly. But that's very symbolic, right? So you get all of these men that were on the ship. And I don't know if you guys remember, but that would be a great dissertation for somebody just to focus on the sailors on that in that story, because the sailors represent the nations to a certain extent, because they called on their gods, right? So what you get from that passage is like multiple gods are being called upon. The sailors are like sort of representing the nations. And they recognize then the sovereignty or the supremacy. Is that even a word? The supreme nature. There you go. The supremacy. Sounds great. The supremacy, right? If I say it with panache, then it'll work. But the supremacy, right? The supremacy of God over other gods. So remember, we said that in the old. This is the interesting thing about the Hebrew Scriptures, right? That throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, there's never any sort of refutation of other gods. There's never a moment when people say, "Hey, those other gods you're worshiping, those aren't real gods." There's an assumption that these are real gods. There's an assumption that there are other gods, but God is supreme, right? So that's what God said in the commandments: "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." There's no images of this God. So there's a lot of wonderful stories in the extra canonical books that have been written about, especially about Abraham and sort of his journey, and like even thoughts of his father owning an idol shop. Was one of the things that was kind of put out there. So there's all kinds of sort of things in the Old Testament about that, and so these sailors represent the nations, and then they recognize that there's a supremacy of God, and they fear the Lord, which is a very interesting way to put it, right?
I think it raises the weird question of like, at what point did they, like, historically, did we transition to monotheism as kind of like the understanding that like there is one God and God alone,
Right.
and then that kind of wiped out culturally the gods behind it as well.
It did, yeah. So I think by the time you get to the time of Jesus, a lot of that has been lost to, in the Jewish world, that was like lost to superstition. So I mean, there's still sort of vestiges of it, here and there, but at that point, I think they're starting to, you can see that more evidently, right? As opposed to earlier when, and archaeological evidence suggests that even during time periods when the scriptures indicate that everybody was doing what they were supposed to be doing, we now know that there were images of God that were created, of Yahweh and Yahweh's consort, right? So that Yahweh had a wife, right? So there were people that were believing that and doing that. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. But it seems to me though that by the time we get to the time of the New Testament, some of that stuff has really started to fade. What happens is it's the Gentiles that have all of the superstition, and so when Paul was it Paul and Silas that get mistaken for Jupiter and Mercury or something, or Hermes or something like that. I don't know. There's something there. I can't remember whether it's Paul and Silas or Paul and Barnabas. But at any rate, people think they're gods because they had a healing. So anyway, So long, sort of convoluted thing. But yeah, that thing about fearing God is really important, because I don't know if you guys remember this last week when I talked about Cornelius and how he's in the sermon. If you were there during the sermon, I called Cornelius a God-fearer. That was what he was known as. So that was actually a classification for people in the Jewish mindset. So someone who was a God-fearer may not have gone through the initiation rites to become Jewish, which is for men is that thing, right? And so at any rate, they may not have done that, but they have started keeping laws. They're minding the Sabbath. They're even praying and giving alms and supporting the synagogue. I mean, there's a lot of things that would constitute a God-fearer, somebody who was a Gentile perhaps, and was also kind of favorable to the Jewish religion. So that's an interesting sort of phrase there that's used. They feared the Lord. And then they offer a sacrifice, which, they remember we talked about that. Like, what did they sacrifice when you throw everything overboard, right? Mm-hmm. So the presumption is that it was some kind of grain offering or a Thanksgiving offering of some kind that was made from their food, their provisions that they still had left. Yeah.
Last time he referenced Jesus saying the only sign you'll get is from the prophet Jonah.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
The only sign you'll get. Hold on, I'll access it. I should know that, but I don't. So, what does the wonderful thing about growing up Baptist is I know a lot of verses. I just don't remember where they were. Yeah, Matthew.
What did he mean?
They asked him for a sign because they were wanting, something that would indicate like who he is. Like, who are you really? So the interesting thing is, as you look through all that passage, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens ahead of time. So that's when the disciples are eating the grain, and then he basically refutes the Sabbath in a way, and then he heals on the Sabbath. So he works on the Sabbath. He's doing, so there's all this stuff that's going on. And then he starts to quote from Isaiah. These people are wondering, like, who the heck is this guy that flouts the Sabbath laws, that flouts our kind of cleanliness laws and all these other things. And so they say, could this be the son of David? And because he heals a guy again, and so then there's a whole battle that takes place between these people, and they go, no, he's from Beelzebub, and that's where he says, well, a house divided against. So Lincoln's famous quote is taken from that particular context: a house divided against itself cannot stand. So he's basically saying, how can you call me the devil when I'm doing God's work, right? If I'm the devil, then I'm do you know what I mean? So he's like, your argument is invalid. And then they say, well, fine, show us the sign. And he's like, the only sign you're going to get is the sign of the prophet Jonah, which indicates, what's going to happen, right? So this is what he says. So let's read through that really quickly because it's kind of interesting. A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign. I always love how Jesus was like so kind to the Pharisees and teachers of the law. The religious people always got the brunt of all of his ire. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now something greater than Jonah is here. So that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that really had to tick them off. The Assyrians are going to condemn you on the last days, right? Cool. Any other questions about last week? Yeah.
So perhaps another dissertation in addition to one on the sailors might be the selection of the whale. I'm fascinated by, it wasn't a shark, it wasn't some medieval prehistoric dinosaur-like, sea creature. It was a whale. And if you've ever seen a whale in person and watched them birth out and things like that, they're magnificent. I mean, they're really something to watch in person. And so I was just curious if there was ever anything written on that.
Technically, it's described as a fish, a great fish.
A big fish.
So there's lots of ink that's been spilt on kind of what that means. Symbolically, we talked about this last week. Symbolically, that is just another way of kind of describing chaos and the deep, and the fact that we talked about Leviathan, which was a symbol of chaos, and all of the different images, and of course whales, and I think we had like a megalodon image, and then Leviathan itself, which was this weird sort of mythical creature from the ancient world. But we did have the conversation about is it possible for a human being to survive in a aside from a miraculous thing. I mean, so I'm not trying to discount the miraculous nature of the story if we are reading it literally. And so if you're reading it literally, then there had to be something kind of miraculous, you would think, right? But then we had this story about the guy from the 1800s that survived inside the sperm whale for a couple of days until they found him. Now, he was messed up and stuff, but he survived.
Scientifically, it could happen. Yeah.
So technically it could happen. So yeah. So that was my whole thing of like throwing a monkey wrench into the non-literal reading. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, in the end, there's a greater sort of meaning of the story that transcends all of the detail, right? Hi.
I meant to email you about this, and I kept listening it over and over. It's great that app, you can listen to them while you're doing other stuff.
Yeah.
But, I know you probably just covered it, and I want a clarification about, because the analogy, how it applies to me as a human being, and I'm just imagining that, how God treated it when he was angry, and here are these, to me, it was very kind people who, like, didn't wanna really throw Jonah into the sea,
Right.
and they, but yet somehow they trusted Jonah's belief, and that's what I interpret, and they're here in, what do you call it, blind faith, that they, woe as, Jonah's Lord, that, hey, give us, this break, for we're saving this kind man, and they really didn't want it, sounds like to me, they didn't really want it to throw him aboard, right?
Yeah. So, okay. So, kind of I want to quickly answer that because we do need to step further in. But so there is truth in the fact that in the text they're saying we don't want to do that, right? They're trying everything else other than that. And so finally, when they do, they pray, right, to be absolved from blame, and then they do as he asked. So, in their minds, obviously this is a terrible thing, but the guy demanded it, right? And then they pray to his God, who apparently is mad, right? Which is why all this is going on. This is not our fault here. We're just giving him back to you, right? You take care of him, right? And so kind of going back to what Jonah was wanting, Jonah, was basically saying, I would rather die than preach to these people. If there's any possibility that God's grace would fall on these Assyrians, I don't want any part of it. I'd rather die, right? And so that's what he's wanting. So the interesting thing is that God does grant him his wish to a certain extent, but that's what we're going to find out today, like what happens when he does, find himself in the belly of the fish. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into the text. So we're going to go to Jonah chapter 2. So we'll do Jonah chapter 2, and we'll work through that a little bit. And then we're going to go to chapter 3. And we'll read through that and kind of march through that as well. Okay, so now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days. So we're going back to chapter 1 just a bit. 3 days and 3 nights. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again towards your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose up to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Okay, so it's pretty clear here that Jonah has descended to the realm of the dead, both symbolically and literally, right? So we talked about this last week about the sea and about the sea representing chaos and the depths representing the depths of chaos, something that can't be controlled, something that you have no power over, right? The sea is that mysterious, kind of thing, right? And so it stands in a lot of Jewish literature for the depths. It stands in for death. It stands in for the unknown, the abyss. and the mysteries that kind of swirl around that, pun intended. So, so he says it right there, right? From deep in the realms of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. So in Jewish literature, the sea, as I said here, represented chaos and certain death for those who try to control it. There is no controlling it. So the interesting thing about that, and it kind of takes us back to last week, is who controls it, right? God. I mean, so God called the fish came and swallowed Jonah, and so now there he sits, right? But here's something else that's super interesting as well. If we kind of fast forward into the New Testament and the story where Jesus is walking on water, then all of a sudden you start to realize as you read into to Jewish literature and you understand a bit more about what they're talking about with the sea and who controls the sea, when Jesus is walking on water, the disciples then are struck by the fact that here is someone in their midst who controls the sea. There's only one who can control the sea. And so there's, and I believe in one of those, it's like they say, like, who are you? And he's like, it is I, or like, I am. So that was the question they asked when he gets into the boat and the sea's calm, like, what manner of man is this? He can control the sea. Well, we all know, well, it's not a man. Sort of a man, but also fully human, right? Fully human in ways that are hard for us to understand. Fully human in the way that Jesus is also, according to church tradition, fully divine. So to be fully human is to be fully divine. We're just not fully human. We're not living into that. So that's an interesting take on it, but that's kind of what that's about. And for people in those early councils, when they're trying to put their mind around that, that's kind of what they wanted to do, is to make sure that people understood that there was, that this was God who we're talking about. And so that's kind of an interesting thought as we're thinking about Jonah and we're thinking about sea. But what does he discover when he's in the bottom of when he's in the whale and he's in the bottom of the, with seaweed wrapped around his head? He's sinking to the roots of the mountains, because that's, what they would have believed, that the roots of the mountains are in the sea. So what does he find there in the end?
Jonah remembers the Lord.
Plants and
Yeah. So if somebody wouldn't mind, if somebody's got your Bible out, if you could turn to Psalm 139, verses 7 through 12, and if you wouldn't mind reading those. We'll do a sword drill here. Wouldn't it have been great to have a cell phone, like an iPhone back then when you do a sword drill, For the uninitiated, a sword drill is something that some of us went through and endured as children, where we would all sit with our Bibles in our laps, and they would say a passage like Jonah 2:1.
7 to 12.
Yeah, or Psalm 139, 7 through 12. And then go, and everyone would go, and they would whoever found it first would stand up, and then they would, so. And you would be a Jedi master sword drill. Who's got it? Might want to read?
What'd you say, Psalm 1?
Psalm 139, 7 through 12.
There's the 7 through 12. I'll read it.
Do it.
All right. Where could I go to get away from your spirit? Where could I go to escape your presence? If I went up to heaven, you would be there. If I went down to the grave, you would be there too. If I could fly on the wings of dawn, stopping to rest only on the far side of the ocean, even there your hand would guide me. Even there your strong hand would hold me tight. If I said, the darkness will definitely hide me, the light will become as night around me. Even then, the darkness isn't too dark for you. Nighttime would shine as bright as day, because darkness is the same as light to you.
Cool, huh? So Jonah, is praying here. I mean, it's a song, a poem, a prayer. I mean, whatever. But I mean, this is an interesting kind of song because it's not a cry for help, is it? I mean, take a look at it.
Almost like he's just stating the facts.
Yeah, especially in like 4 when he's like, "Yet I shall look again upon your holy temple." So it's like already kind of an expectation that I just have to, like, it'll happen again.
Trust.
Yeah.
Isn't it
Yeah.
trusting him, knowing what he means to him? It's to trusting God.
Right.
I mean, I that's what I remember praying. So
Yeah.
think it-
So he's stating. So we're getting around. So he's stating facts. So he's stating a fact. He's saying, I'm going to look again at your holy temple, which is a really, really kind of cool when you think about it. Like, there's a saying in the Holy Land when they say, like, until we meet again next year in Jerusalem. And then there's also in wedding ceremonies, in Jewish wedding ceremonies, they'll actually there's a psalm that they'll actually say, if I forget Jerusalem, may my tongue cleave to my mouth. I mean, it's like a whole thing. So it's like there's always this concept of like returning and seeing the temple and having those visions in your mind. That's part of it's the heart of who you are within the Jewish faith. And so as he's indicating here, there's like I'm gonna go, and I'm gonna go to the temple when this is over. You know what I mean? I'm going to see it again. I'm going to worship again, right? Yeah.
And maybe it's just the interpretation I have here, but it seems like he still doesn't quite get it as I read through this.
Okay. Tell me what you're like. Give me an example of what you're.
He has he's still not taking responsibility on a lot of things. You hurled me into the depths,
Right.
into the very heart of the sea,
Right.
and the currents rolled over me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I mean, there still seems to be this resistance
Okay.
of complete surrender.
Okay. So, I mean, that's an interesting thought, and I think as we'll see, kind of going forward when we get into the subsequent chapters, you'll start to see that Jonah's not 100% on board, right? But he's definitely 100% on board at this point of not dying, right? I mean, once he realized where he was, and then it kind of hit him, then he does say in here. So this is all past tense. I called for help, right? So he indicates at one point that he does call for help, and you listen to my cry. So in my distress, I called to the Lord, and He answered me. So it's past tense, right? So we're kind of assuming at this point that as he's sinking, he realizes I'm done for and calls out, and then finds himself in the fish. So in the fish now he's doing something. So what do you do when you if you almost got in a really bad car wreck? What is the first thing that you would probably say?
Give thanks.
Thank God, right? Or you did get in a wreck and you're like I did one time. I pulled right out in front of somebody and they were and all I could see was the car coming and I was like, oh, I'm dead. I mean that just went through my head. I'm dead. Thankfully, I was in a Volkswagen and a superior vehicle, which had airbags upon airbags upon airbags, and everything went off. And then I sat there going like this. Am I still here? Is anything broken? I'm still moving, and then you're like, oh, thanks be to God, right? Anne Lamott says there's basically only 3 prayers: help, thanks, and wow. Right? So Jonah hasn't gotten to wow, And we know that he prayed help. So what is he doing here?
He's prophesying.
Okay.
The last phase of verse 9. Salvation belongs to the Lord.
Right. So he's making a vow of what he's going to do when he gets out of here. So that's so he says, what I have vowed, I will make it good. Right? So you can assume there that there was some bargaining that was probably going on. You get me out of this, man. I mean, who among us has not done that, right? God, if you let me, survive this, or if you let me pass this test, or if you let me get out of this. So he says, what I vowed I will make good, I will say salvation comes from the Lord. So what exactly did he vow that he would do, right? Did he vow that he was going to go and do what God told him to do?
Not yet.
No, just a sacrifice. I mean, not just a sacrifice, but my translation says, "Me, I will offer a sacrifice to you with a voice of thanks," which is, in Jewish practice was pretty standard for good fortune that arrived.
Right.
So it's
So right now he still hasn't so kind of going back to Ken's point, there's just like a hint there that he still isn't quite there, but yet he's realizing something's going on. And then to Bob's point, he is prophesying to a certain extent. He's saying, okay, this is what I'm going to do when I get out of here. There's a,
I was thinking of Christ.
say more about that.
Well, salvation comes from him.
Okay.
Foreshadowing.
I think it's entirely possible to see the story of Jesus and the deaths and resurrection in this story. I absolutely. And in fact, we just spent a whole bunch of time talking about him referencing it, right? So this is obviously something that was in his mind as well. So there's lessons to be learned from this. So if you're reading it that way, so if we're reading it in a spiritual sense, which I think that's not what we're doing right at this second, but we can, that's a way to read it, is if to have a spiritual reading of the text means that you're extracting meaning from it that is kind of transcends its own context, right? That you're able to see clearly, there's something going on here that connects to something else. So yeah, you're right. Yep.
I would agree with Bob. I think it's kind of a variation on a theme we see throughout the Bible.
Yeah.
It's almost like the Job moment when Job basically says, okay, well, God says to Job, I'm God, you're not.
Right.
I think this is another, you're God, I'm not. And you see that, of course, with Christ too, and I command my spirit. So the fight, the argument's over.
Yeah.
And now, I think it is implied.
So I
That he's
think
going to Nineveh,
I-
that he's making that vow, by the
it
way.
could be. There's a sacrifice that's definitely involved, but we're going to say something here in a second that no, it's true. Because I used to always believe that these things were sequential, right? But we're going to find out something in a second that may throw a little bit of monkey wrench in that. But I will say that as we're thinking through this, from our Christian perspective, to realize what he's saying has bigger implications than just what he thinks, right? That salvation comes from the Lord quite honestly, that's the theme of the whole thing, right? the whole thing is pointed to that, right? It's the story of how God is saving the world, right? And it's all leading up to the penultimate moment of history. That looks forward and also looks back. So yeah, good stuff. Okay, so I wanted to throw this little Jacques Ellul quote in there because he's a pretty awesome theologian. If you want to look him up, you can kind of read some of his stuff. A lot of it's pretty esoteric, but this was really interesting. He wrote about this story, and I just really loved what he said about this particular moment. That which denotes death also has within it the presence of life. And so it's almost like hope is never lost, right? It doesn't matter where you go, God will find you there, right? So there's some tremendous hope that's embedded in that. And so he's singing a song of thanksgiving is what he's doing. So that's the song that he's singing. He's been rescued. But the interesting thing about Jewish prayers and Jewish songs of thanksgiving is that there's also kind of in the midst of that, there's almost a way of kind of like pushing God a tad, right? So a lot of the Jewish poets and Jewish prophets would constantly remind God of how awesome God was and how kind and gracious God was and how merciful God was. Like, we're just going to tell you all the things about how you're so merciful and forgiving and magnanimous and gracious, right? You know this, right? But we're going to remind you anyway. You know, so it's sort of like I'm going to say to God what God knows about God, but I'm going to say it because I want God to know that I know this about God, so that God will basically be merciful to me, right? That this is all going to come out in the end, right? I'm going to remind God of God's faithfulness and all the things that God has done. So it's kind of it's a very Jewish way of speaking to God. And I love that about the prophets. I love it about if you read in the text of a lot of the prophets, and including, like we were talking about Habakkuk earlier, so Habakkuk actually stands and argues with God. There's like sections in Habakkuk where God speaks and then Habakkuk replies and is debating God. Moses debated God as well. Abraham debated God. You go through the text and you see all of these struggles against God. And so in our Western sort of mindset, that sounds kind of odd. When you say to people, it's okay for you to rail against God. It's okay for you to be mad at God. It's okay for you to shake your little tiny fist and whatever. It's part of the great tradition. It's part of this tradition is to do that. And then also to remind God sometimes that God is merciful. The name Israel, right? The name Israel is what is kind of just, it's the umbrella of all of those traditions of struggling, because it means he or the wrestlers of God, those who struggle with God. In particular, when it came to Jacob, when he was given a new name, it was Israel. So that meant the one who wrestled with God, right? So it's like this idea of the people who are contending with the Almighty. So they take it seriously, right? They take it seriously in their tradition. And you can see that in here as well. Embedded in his thanksgiving is this little you let me out of here, man, and I'm gonna tell people that salvation comes from the Lord. You're merciful, you're amazing, but just reminding you. Any other questions about that before we move on to chapter 3? Okay, so let's dive into chapter 3 because this is where it starts to get really interesting. All right, so then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. I'm channeling my Monty Python right there. You do not leave, I will taunt you a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and claim to it the message I give you. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Okay, so there's the word of the Lord, the dabar of Yahweh. So that's the word in Hebrew, dabar, the word. It actually has this connotation of more than just a word, more than just something that's spoken. It has to do with an event, like a word event. How do you speak of God? I mean, what language? I mean, what kind of language do we use to talk about God? Like, what are the things that we say?
Father,
I usually say like descriptions, descriptors,
Right, descriptors: Father, Sustainer, Creator.
peace, mercy, justice.
So when we talk about God, though, like the things that God does, like what do we do then? Like how do we, because we're trying to put our minds around it, right? So what do we usually say? You'll hear people say all kinds of things, right? You ever heard somebody say, "The Lord told me to do that"? Right? You ever heard? Who's heard that? Right? Yeah. People do that, man. They still do it. I'll have people that be like, man, the Lord just told me to do this, and I'm like, and I'm horribly jaded. So I'm like, really? What did that sound like when that happened? Like what does it feel like? Because I want to get to the bottom of it. And sometimes, honestly, it's like I'm like, I don't know if I can argue with that. I mean, that sounds pretty legit. Like something happened there, I mean, God knows I've had moments where I've felt that. I've heard things in my own head that I couldn't explain. I mean, so, but sometimes there are people that say, the Lord told me to do that, but unfortunately, the Lord's voice sounds a whole lot like theirs, right?
The Lord told this pastor to buy that big jet.
Yeah, the
The
Lord told Creflo Dollar to do that, right? The Lord wants this. But yeah, so kind of let's dig into some things that are a little more like meaningful, right? So yeah.
I remember once you preached a sermon, there was something where you were in London.
Yep.
And Meredith told you you were supposed to, I think you left the British Museum or the
We did.
Portrait Gallery.
Yep.
And that you were supposed to go to St. Paul's, is that right?
We did. Yep.
And
Yeah.
so
I told, like I said, it's happened to me.
Experience, but you absolutely believed it.
I did.
And it's not different, except for maybe the voice part. But substantively, it's not different.
No, and I've
You
heard,
really felt that.
I've heard, like I said, I mean, it has happened to me.
Exactly.
So, that is a phrase, though, that, when you use it,
People laugh, but you didn't laugh then, and you're
No.
right.
no. And it's because, like I said, when I'm talking to somebody and, they say that, I mean, automatically I'm just like, yeah, okay. But then, like I said, when you start digging around, sometimes you're like, holy smokes. Maybe the Lord did tell you that. I don't know. Because I've had experiences where it's been in my head, where the voice was in my head. And it, so those are things that have happened. So what are some other things, though, that we use to sort of describe, like, how God is working?
That we feel his presence.
Okay, the presence of God. I felt the presence. What else? I mean, there's a lot of different things, right? But the moment, here's the interesting thing, though. The moment that we begin to describe it, we diminish it. We diminish God. We diminish, because it's beyond. You cannot, like, to speak of God then minimizes, any understanding of God. But we can't help it because we don't have any other way to do this.
The finite cannot comprehend the infinite.
Right. So there's a wonderful book, if you ever want to read it. It's by a guy named Peter Rollins. It's called How Not to Speak of God. And he talks about this, right? This whole idea, the moment that you begin to speak of God, you've already diminished your own understanding of God, right? And so that's interesting, it's really stuff. But, so that's what's kind of going on. The reason why I did all that is because this Hebrew word, dabar, has to do with event. It's like, so what is happening here is like, it's more than just go say this, right? You are carrying with you the event of God to these people. It's not just you're going to go preach. You're carrying something bigger, right? So that's kind of cool. Yeah.
I mean, isn't Debar the word in the Genesis stories that when God, that's what God does in Genesis to create everything around us is
Right.
Debar.
Yes.
So it's not just sound or
No.
word or whatever. It is it's both word and tangible all at the same time is how I try to think about it.
Absolutely. So Debar being the sort of creative, expressive thing that happens to, that's sort of like the engine of all of this, like this, So it's really amazing when you start digging into that and think about what then Jonah is asked to do, right? So here's the fun part. There's midrash. So there in the Jewish tradition, there's there's something called midrash, which is basically just commentary. So it's like teachings and stories and so forth that explain the text. And so in some of the midrash that covers this particular passage and this particular verse, there are some teachings in the Jewish tradition that believe that there was a space of time that happened between chapter 2, verse 10 and chapter 3, verse 1. That Jonah, I mean, and again, I'm only just sharing this, right, because it's interesting to me, but that their teaching is that Jonah went and hung up his prophet's robe, that he gave up, right? He did, he might have gone and done his vow, he sacrificed the stuff that he was supposed to do, but then gave up because he thought that God was done with him, right? That being vomited upon the shore, being saved was enough, right? But that I'm done, that he hung it up. So it's an interesting kind of thing. And I guess the reason why I like that is because, I mean, it's not in the text. I mean, the text is sequential, but there's, the Jewish understanding of then is a lot different than ours, right? So then could be like the next day, but it also could be 20 years later, in kind of their mind. And so why is that important? Like, why would that be interesting? Why would we want to think about that? Why does that matter to you and me?
Doesn't matter what point you are in life. You should be listening.
Yeah, have you ever screwed up really, really bad?
No.
Every day.
So, I mean, that teaching, that midrash is like super cool because it kind of puts us in a situation where we're like, okay, sometimes you might feel like my best days are behind me, or like I did that thing and it messed everything up. That relationship is over. That mistake that I made caused all that pain, and now I can't make it back. I can't go back. I can forgive myself perhaps. I can go through the stuff. I can be religious. I can fulfill my vows or whatever. I can do all those things, but in the end, God's not gonna use me, right? You know what I mean? So it's like, that's a really interesting take on that part of the story, because he gets another shot, right? And so regardless of how you interpret that, whether you take the midrash and you hold on to it and you think that's awesome and you want to make that something that's part of the story for you, or it's like the moment after he gets barfed onto the beach, that the word of the Lord comes to him. The fact of the matter is that the word of the Lord came to him a second time, and then what happens?
But he kind of messed up again.
Kinda, but at this point he obeys, right? So he gets another shot, and he goes into the city. Okay, so let's jump into some of this stuff, because there's some really, it's like, I've always wondered when I was reading this when I was a kid, I always wondered, like, why are these numbers in here? And was it really that big? Because archaeologically, like when we go to the archaeological sites for ancient Nineveh, it's not that big. It doesn't take you 3 days to get across it. It would take you like an hour, right? And maybe not even an hour. It would take you an hour because of ox carts and stuff, and traffic. So Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. If you've ever been to a Middle Eastern city, though, and you go through the market, you might get it. It's just like, hey, come in here. You're like, oh, okay, I'm gonna go shopping now, I guess. So Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. The Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. When Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued to Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink, but let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent with compassion, turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. When God saw that they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. Okay, now we're not going to get into Jonah's response this week. We're going to get into Jonah's response next week, which is full of all kinds of awesome. But at this point, we have there's some interesting things that are going on. So Nineveh is a 3-day, it's a 3-day journey across Nineveh, which we know is some hyperbole. So why would that be hyperbole? Why is that there? Like, what's going on with the number 3?
It's something like the symbolic nature of the number 3 to the Hebrew people. So like all numbers kind of tell a story or something.
Yeah, and so when you look at the number 3, and I kind of put the notes on there that it signifies completeness. Okay, so like the number 7, it's very connected. Okay, there are 3 righteous patriarchs that are before the flood, and there's 3 righteous patriarchs after the flood. And then when you get into the New Testament, of course, the number 3 is pretty significant for us because of Jesus being 3 days in the tomb. Now, for Christians, the number 3 is very significant, obviously. And I preached on this a while ago. I think it was on, I can't remember. I preached on the Trinity, and I talked about how 3 is a magic number and how it's embedded in all of creation. This idea of the Trinity is something that is throughout everything. It's all of it. And so that even though this isn't obviously in the Jewish context is not interpreted as a Trinitarian text, we start to pick up some of these themes like Bob. When you're looking for it and you're starting to see, you can begin to realize, oh, okay, I can see something going on here, right? So 3 is important and 40 is important. So 40, there's a 40 days deadline that's given. Now, where do you guys see 40 in the scriptures? Jesus in the wilderness, Noah. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights.
40 years in the desert.
40 years in the wilderness. Yep. Before that, Moses was 40 years a shepherd. So, what's going on with that? I mean, 40 is a number that really and truly gives us an understanding of preparation. It's a time of preparation. It's a time of refinement. It's a time when you are given an opportunity to reflect and to decide, kind of what I'm going to do. To realize that God is God and that you are not. So it's all these sort of things, right? So the people of Israel, they wandered for 40 years, because they were being prepared, right? You can say that it was a punishment, because it sounds like it in the text when you read it, because of this, you're going to have to wander. Was it a punishment? Was it this, like, because you did this, now I'm going to banish you for 40 years? Or was it like, this is what you need because you're not ready? You're going to need this. Even Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness prior to his ministry, right? So as soon as he is baptized, he is driven by the Spirit, it says, into the wilderness, where he then is tested by the accuser, the prosecuting attorney, Satan, what we call Satan. The Satan is, in the Jewish tradition, is a prosecuting attorney. That points out all the bad things that you do. And so Jesus, basically is tempted by all of the things, right? He's tempted by power. He's tempted by, demonstrating who he is ahead of time. Just all the things, right? With his frailty. He's tempted with that as well, the frailty of being human. And he resists it all. So the interesting thing about 40 is it also is a significant psalm as well. Psalm 40, I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. The interesting thing about all of these texts, right, is the significance of being delivered isn't for the sake of the person, so to speak. It's for the sake of what? What did he say? Many will see and what? Many will see and fear the Lord. Many will see and believe. What did the sailors do? They feared the Lord, right? What is happening here in Nineveh? They're starting to fear the Lord, right? So the theme throughout Jewish history and throughout, in the understanding of who the Jewish people were, is that they were called upon essentially to be a priestly nation, right? And so when I say priestly nation, and even Peter draws on this when he's talking to Christians later on, he draws on the Jewishness of that understanding and now conveys it to the church that's full of Gentiles. This is now your calling as well, right? That you are a royal priesthood. Now, what do priests do?
Lead the flock.
They lead the flock, right? But so they're doing something when they're doing that. What?
They teach, they broker God. They tell everybody about God and God's good things.
Okay, so they're telling people about God, but what they're doing is they're pointing, right? They're serving as a way to point people to God, by the actions, by the things that they're doing, by the symbolism of all of the worship and so forth. They're pointing people to God. And so that is essentially what Israel's role is to be in amongst the nations, right? Is to point people to the one true God. And so, that's what you see here within the text is that Jonah is not saved just so that he can go back and do whatever he was doing before. He's rescued so that he can go now and bear witness and, preach and share. To point people to the one true God. Okay, so think about this. Let's take a look at the last bit of that, right? So first of all, Jonah goes into the city. Even though it takes 3 days to get across, how far does he go into it?
1 day.
So he travels 1 day in. So he's like basically halfway, right? Sort of. And then he preaches. And then, what happens?
Dominoes.
It's dominoes, right? Like, all of a sudden, the Ninevites believe, right? That's the first thing that happens. And all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth, right? And so then it reaches the king of Nineveh. He rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued in Nineveh. And then he goes on. It's like, I don't know if you guys think that's odd. It's like, okay, we're going to put sackcloth on all of the critters as well. It's like, we're serious here.
Cover your bases. Cover all the bases.
This is how serious this is. Even the animals are going to repent. Like, everybody's going to repent.
Did Jonah give them those guidelines, or where did they come up with these things they were gonna do?
He didn't say anything except repent, right?
I know,
You got 40 days, people.
yeah, so they thought this is what should be done.
Okay, so really, really, really interesting. Okay, you want to hear something interesting? Really interesting. Okay, so when we were talking at the very beginning of the class last week, and we were talking about the text that people had problems with. Like, what are your problem texts when you talk about God? Like, people were like, oh, some of y'all were like, oh, yeah, the ones where God told people to kill all these people, and what? They're animals. Everything, right? So those texts where we see that happening, right? There's this, there's this idea of like, it's all contaminated and you've got to get rid of all of it, right? Now we struggle with that, and I know that those texts can be debated and dissected and torn apart, and there's evidence to suggest archaeologically that a lot of these peoples that even in the scripture declares that they were completely and utterly destroyed were not. There were still cities and so forth that were maintained. But at any rate, that was the mentality of the people who were thinking about these texts and thinking about what happened. So I mean, I'm going to go like all literary on you at this point and maybe historical. So all of these things were basically, a lot of these stories were compiled during the Babylonian captivity, because up until that point, the texts were, scattered and disparate, and they weren't really all in kind of, one place, so to speak. So when the temple is destroyed and the center of your religious, because they didn't really need the text, right? I mean, if you think about it that way, they didn't really need the text. They had a bunch of priests, and they had a temple, and they had all the stuff, and they just told them, this is what you're supposed to do, and this is what you're supposed to believe, and these are the things that you're supposed to know. I mean, so they wouldn't, so all of these things that then exist after the Babylonian captivity exist because now in the Babylonian captivity, there is no temple, right? There's nothing to go back to. So what do you do in the midst of that? You want to remember everything that you can possibly remember about what was, right? And what was part of your existence. And so that's where all this is starting to get pulled together. So is it possible that some scholar, that was part of this tradition wanted to make sure that it was put in there that we should have killed all these people when we had the chance? Right? In some of those texts in the before. But then you have the troubling text of Jonah, where the Assyrians, like the horrible, stinking, rotten Assyrians, are repenting. All the way down to the animals. Right? It's like a reversal of what, so in one case, and so in one sense, and we're going to see this when we get to Nahum, right? We're going to start seeing like not that, right? That God is not, being quite as merciful, right? So, isn't that kind of interesting though? I mean, what do you make of that with the animals and stuff? Because that always confused me. I was like, I don't know why. But then when you start thinking about it in terms of the other things that were told by the people of Israel, you're supposed to kill everything, including the animals. And now all of a sudden God is rescuing and redeeming everything, including the animals. Kind of cool. So, what do we make of this?
A question I've had along that line is, God used the Assyrians and the Babylonians as punishment for Israel. So,
They believed that.
yeah, well, that's kind of what I get out of the
Yeah,
story.
they believed that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
So now whether or not you
Is
want to...
God maybe being a little lenient now that he's got his message across?
I don't know. And that's the question of the whole book, right? It's like, what's going on here? And what are you supposed to do, Israel? What are you supposed to do, Israel, when I show grace to your neighbors? What is your role in this? Yeah.
Well, and one of the things, so going with that, Bob, the Lord, the Devar of God is 40 days more and Nineveh will be overthrown.
Yes.
There's not a conditionality to it, there's not a unless, there's not, I mean, when the word comes the second time, God says, declare against it the proclamation I am commanding you. And, in the more literary midrashy way I tend to read Jonah, I figure Jonah walks that, into the city just a ways and stands there and goes, 40 days more, y'all are overthrown, and walks back out again. So, what we've seen of Jonah, I don't see that Jonah's gonna be like adding anything onto it.
He didn't give him any conditions.
No, he's not gonna add any conditions or say, well, back home, if God was this mad, we would do this, nothing. It's just
I'm
like,
not going to help you out here.
I'm not helping you. You guys are.
I did what I was supposed to do.
Right, and I'm out.
But it was funny because going back to Psalm 40, I kept reading a little bit more, and like about halfway through, starting at like 7, it's like, then it said, "Behold, I have come, and in the scroll in the book it is written of me, I will delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is written in my heart. I have told the good news, the glad news of deliverance." Because that was not Jonah's attitude at all.
No. He said he was going to,
Yeah.
right? I will tell you that salvation comes from the Lord. So his message is in 40 days. Let's see, what does he exactly say, right? 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. He doesn't tell him salvation comes from the Lord, right? Well, there's a reason why he doesn't want to tell him that, as we'll find out in chapter 4. Because he wanted it to burn, right? Yeah.
Is this the reason why the Jews find this so important? Is that their arch enemies, the people who were the most horrible to them, are now redeemed, and that redeems them?
I think that that's definitely how, in our particular kind of context now, that's how it would be interpreted. So in a modern context, which is exactly what the rabbi that came and that spoke at my church, who was preaching on this text and told us this is a definitive text for the Jewish people, because there is something to be said about that, and I think that's something we can really kind of put our hands around next week when we get into chapter 4, is the redemption of the redemption of Jonah is up in the air at the end of the story. It reminds me of another story that was told by a really awesome rabbi about a man who had 2 sons, and then at the end of that story, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's up in the air, right? And the implications are the same in the parable of the prodigal son and in the parable here, or the story here, right? The implications are the same at the end of it. Which we'll see in chapter 4, is that there's something that you have to do. How will you respond now to the event of God? How will you respond to the great redemption of God? Will you join in the party, or will you be like, screw you, right?
I was just thinking that when we were thinking about this, if this hadn't worked out this way, it would have been a different twist, and they hadn't repented. It'd be a completely different story. Jonah would have been right to not want to go.
Yeah.
So it would have been kind of like the story of the prodigal son, in terms of if he'd come back and the father would have rejected him.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have worked out. It wouldn't have been a lesson for us.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows?
That's true. So there's a lot riding on all of this, right? And so Jonah, as we've discovered already, we've got a hint that Jonah is not doing them any favors. And so the kind of the application of that is, you can sort of do what God says to do, or follow God's commands, by the letter of the law, but not really embrace the spirit of it. Who might that sound like within our biblical witness? The people who were all about the letter and not about the spirit. Yeah. So there's a warning there within the text that we're already starting to see, is that you can become so caught up in your own, sort of your own ideas about faithfulness and what that means, and your own ideas of being other, and there's all these people that are other that I don't have any responsibility for. And then here he's realizing, right? He realizes slowly over time, and then finally maybe he gets it at the end. We don't know. We don't really know for sure. But he starts to come to the realization that these people matter to God. These people that aren't the chosen people matter to God. Yeah, and then back there.
Well, it just seems like for the people in Nineveh that are supposed to have been so evil, they were remarkably receptive. And so it's sort of a lesson of, when we think someone is really, very sinful, that, look what happened. They repented.
Right. Yeah. Like he thought there's no way. First of all, we find out later that he's like, there's no way they're going to repent, so I'm going to go watch this happen.
Yeah. Get a good deal.
But even before so you get that next, right? But before that, you get the animosity and the fear and the sort of gut wrenching, like, these are my enemies. There's no way I don't even want to share with them. And in fact, he doesn't even share with them any good news. He just says that you're going to die. And that's all that he says to him. Which actually a really, so I'm going to do a rabbit trail here. I don't even know what time it is. What time is it?
7:12.
Okay, cool. So can God use like awful people to draw other people to God? I mean, yeah, right? I mean, so it's kind of this interesting thing, like, so when like religious leaders have like colossal meltdowns, right, or they, there's collapses, there's a lot of people then they'll lose their faith, or they, and rightly so. I mean, I'm not trying to take away from the pain of that, right? But what happens then is that everything that they thought to be true, because this person collapsed, and all the things that they said and all the things that they taught and everything they represented, now all of a sudden none of that is true. So therefore nothing that they said was true. But people who are centered in their faith understand that it doesn't matter who says it. Sometimes the method and the message is imperfect, but God can take that. And so in this case, it's wonderful and beautiful, right? That Jonah doesn't give them crap. I mean, he just says, you're going to die. And then they go, okay, let's repent. Well, I mean, and the implication there is they assume, okay, this guy's Jewish, so he must be talking about his God, right? And so, but it's not there in the text. I mean, just all of a sudden they just realize that it's God. And I mean, it's just that part is cool, because it's like, God is like, okay, I know you're trying to screw this up, but I'm going to fix this anyway. Israel, you're constantly trying to screw this up, but I'm going to fix it anyway, right? So yeah. So what else kind of stands out from you from that text, or any of the kind of surrounding text that we were dealing with?
Well, excuse me, in my Bible, it says way up here in 10,
Okay.
verse 10, it says, but I with the voice of praise will sacrifice to thee. I will pay whatsoever, I have vowed for my, it's italicized, for my salvation to the Lord. So he still is selfish in his.
Where is that?
In verse 10, chapter 2, verse 10.
You mean 8 and 9?
See how different it is? Mine's 10, but.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, but it says.
What kind of Bible is that?
Bible, so maybe it's different.
It shouldn't be.
Yeah, but it says, but I with the voice of praise will sacrifice to thee. I will pay whatsoever I have vowed for my salvation to the Lord.
Okay, so that's a translation of it's verse 9 and almost every other text, I think, right? So verse 9 and then 10 is the fish. So anyway, whatever verse that is translated here. But I with shouts of grateful praise will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord. So that's in the NIV. I don't know what else. Does anybody have like anything else?
I have the ESV. It says about the same thing.
Okay.
And you know what I was thinking is that's why in my salvation's important. So he goes to those people and says, well, 40 days. And
Okay.
So he's half-hearted about it. All he cares about is his end of the bargain, that he goes and does whatever he can to regain his praise from the Lord.
Okay, so this is an interesting thing so because that popped up, right? So because your translation has a different way of kind of seeing it, I mean, the same thing is true, right? So we get to the same place. But it does, so this needs to be said. I mean, it does matter to a certain extent, like what translation you use when you're trying to get to the bottom of some things. Now, typically, most of us, like a lot of the Bibles I have are NIV, so that's New International Version. Some people have, ESV, which is the English Standard Version. There's like a zillion different kinds. New King James,
Open English.
yeah, NRSV, New Revised Standard Version. I mean, so blah blah blah. You can go on ad nauseum. So it doesn't matter what you read in terms of getting getting what you need out of the text. In fact, I sometimes will read two or three different translations, right? Including really the Message, which is in modern day language, which a lot of biblical scholars turn their nose up at it. But Eugene Peterson was Presbyterian, so we can claim him, and he was a fantastic Greek and Hebrew scholar who spent years and years and years, unlike me, when he sat down with the text to preach every Sunday for 30 some odd years when he was preaching. He would first translate the text from Hebrew or Greek into English. Kudos, man. I got books for that, man. I took all those languages, man, but oof. Greek was great. Loved Greek. Hebrew, man, it is tough. Reading from left to right. There's like no vowels. It's just dots. Good Lord. So anyway, yeah. So I think it's good when you're reading these to have multiple kind of versions. And if you need a version, if you want something, there's an app on that you can get on your phone. That's called the YouVersion app, and you can download for free just about every kind of translation of the Bible that you can imagine. And then you can have them on your phone, and so you can switch back and forth from different translations as you're reading a text. Sometimes it's kind of helpful to do that. And really, in a cool thing, they have reading plans that you can do where you can use your phone and sort of read your Bible from your phone. Or if you don't like that, you can at least do the reading plan and read it from the Bible that you have. But they have devotions. They've got all kinds of cool stuff. It's really neat.
And it's YOU?
It's YouVersion, YOU. There's a church in Oklahoma that started it, Life Church in Oklahoma, and they launched it several years ago, and now it's like in the number one Bible app in the whole freaking world. I mean, it's like, and they get it's donations and stuff now. But it takes millions of dollars to keep it afloat, and they do that as a gift to the world. That church does. It's amazing. Yeah.
There's a interesting part in chapter 3, when God saw what they did, he relented.
Yeah, so we haven't even talked about that, have we? So God changed God's mind?
Yeah.
Right.
What the heck?
Yeah.
I thought that God was unchanging. I mean, even God says that, right? That God is immutable. That, you can always count on God because God's never changing. But yet, we see that there's something in that. The text clearly says that God relented and did not bring on them the destruction that he had threatened. It's like, okay. Now, so what do we do with that? What do we do with the fact that we have immutability, and yet we seem to see in the text that God changes God's mind? And this is not the only place that this happens,
Well,
right?
a lot of times, it's the only way that we as humans can grasp God.
Right.
And
So so that's really cool, and isn't it? Right. So what did you guys hear? What Bob said? Okay. So when you're trying to put your mind around the fact that there's this sort of thing that was out there that says this is going to happen, and then it doesn't, then how do you put your mind around that? Right. The fact that God said, and God always does what God says. So why wouldn't I mean, so then the only thing that you can come up with is the fact that, well, God must have relented, so God must have changed God's mind.
Or we use that language.
Exactly.
We spoke to God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or,
Which I think we
or,
do too often.
right. Like maybe we messed that up. You know? Maybe that wasn't, what?
If you look at the Old Testament, to me, I couldn't be here last week, but that to me would have been my most troubling moment.
Yeah.
I thought it would have been Saul, where God says, I'm sorry I made Saul king.
Right.
And so I think you can't read through the Old Testament without having the uncomfortable moment of God not knowing ahead of time, at least with the Saul story. Whereas here you can sort of think, well, maybe God kind of knew ahead of time that the people of Nineveh were outstanding. We're going to respond in an outstanding way.
Right.
So with this passage, you could think that, but if you look at the whole Old Testament, you just can't.
Yeah.
You're going to maybe live with some discomfort.
Ah.
Because then you have the Saul
See,
song,
now-
I'm sorry I made Saul king.
Now we're getting at the heart of our thesis, right?
I'll
Yep.
call you on your daily devotion about how, you know, it was like, you know, I can't quote you, but how we perceive God or time, it's not linear.
Right.
You know, in the way things are, and of course, we're limited by our, what do you call it? Our finite,
Right.
right, being and stuff like that. I mean, it's just, God's, someone told me God's forever changing one time, and I wasn't sure what that means, but it was just like, time is forever. I mean, it's just God's concept of time and teaching us, it's like a revolving door.
Okay. So this is a perfect example of what we were just talking about the limitations of our understanding. And so anything that we use, whenever we use metaphor, you know, we are doing the best that we can. We're using the best language that we have, which is metaphor. See, people diminish the language of metaphor because we've come to understand metaphor as something that is less than. But particularly within this context, metaphor is the greatest thing that you could possibly use. And I think that that's something that we have to regain, is our understanding of being able to be comfortable with metaphor, and then also to be comfortable with some inconsistencies in the text, despite the fact that it makes us uncomfortable. And where do we get comfort from that? Because, you know, we're starting to dig into it and realize that some of this, and I know this is scandalous for some people, but some of this may have been written by people. You know? You ever hear that the history is written by the victors? So going back to your David thing about being sorry that I made Saul king, who do you think is writing all that down at that point? Like who's compiling that? Was Saul like sort of, you know, Saul was like, hey guys, so this happened today. God said that he was sorry he made me king. Let's write that down. No, right?
The whole issue of, to what extent should we feel very, very comfortable picking and choosing in the Bible?
Right.
And then that brings up a whole other set of issues.
Absolutely. So being comfortable is not what we're after, right? Being comfortable is not what we're after.
No, to some extent it's like well, I'm God and you're not. You sort of come back to that response ultimately. It's in
Well,
here, and you may not like it, but it's there.
And so that also comes back to something that we're going to be really touching on as well, which is is every aspect of the Bible to be given the same amount of weight? I mean, do we hold it as dear, all the bits of it?
Well, we're kind of New Testament people.
Right.
If we're here, so we probably do hold some things more dear.
Sure. We each have and each one of us individually has a canon of our own within the New Testament that we hold on to.
I like the red letters.
Haha, yeah, see, right. I mean, I'm down with that. You know, some of Paul's stuff really is just damned him. You know, I mean, it's like, I can't figure the guy out. You know, like, what the hell? You know, like, one minute he's like the greatest feminist in the face of the earth, and the next minute he's telling women to cover their hair and be quiet. You know, so it's really interesting. These are things that we have discomfort with, and so when we have, that's what this whole class is about what do we do when we have these conflicting things? What does it lead us to do? So in this particular context, they're less bothered by the inconsistencies than we are. You know, the ancient Hebrew mindset was not one to, you know, I mean, they sat around and debated it and struggled over it and wrestled over it. I mean, I've told this story before, but, you know, it's like the two rabbis that were arguing over a passage of scripture, and they'd argued for their entire lives. I mean, they were like young men, and they were finally old men, and they're still arguing. And finally God is like, oh my gosh, I've had enough. And so he goes down, God does, and says, fine, I'm going to tell you what this means just to shut you both up. And they go, how dare you? You don't have the right to do that, you know, to tell us what it means. I mean, because the idea was that we have to wrestle with this, right? So the wrestling with it does bring us to some interesting places where we're confronted with, okay, what do I do with that, right? But then there's the other part of it that we talked about last week, which was, you know, we can get lost sometimes in the facts and trying to debate the facts, and we lose sight of the meaning. And so, you know, being able to debate the facts is really awesome and fun, and we're going to do that, and we're going to dig around and get our, you know, fingers dirty and all the rest of it. But in the end, ultimately, there's a message here, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Just
Yep.
one more thing that, remember you were saying everything goes back and forth, almost like there is no time. And this, mine is 10 again, down here, God spares Nineveh.
Mm-hmm.
But it's different, it doesn't say relent, like he's backing down or wishy-washy. It says, and God saw their works, that they were turned from their evil way, and God had mercy with regard to the evil which he had said that he would do to them, and he did it not. So this one shows mercy that goes to the New Testament. Our idea of a God
Right.
that is merciful as
Right.
opposed to the...
So that right there is that's taken some, for the translator, taking some liberties with the text, which is fine. You know, I mean, that's fine to do if they're you know, that's the translator's prerogative. But to be able to lift out of the text kind of what's embedded in it,
Instead
right?
of relenting or giving up, you know, like equivocating.
Right.
It's showing mercy, it's a positive thing.
Exactly. So you know, it's a way of taking relenting and reforming it and reshaping it. Yeah. So there's some other moments in the Bible, and I've always struggled with. There's some moments that I struggled with as well, like the moment with Saul, but also where Abraham, you know, like Abraham is bargaining with God, and he keeps bargaining, and you know, for the Sodom, and if there's you know 50 people, if there's 10 people, if there's, you know, and you know, in that particular context, you kind of see some of the patience of God in this. So you know, if you want to use some of those texts, where like Moses and God having these fights are really, really awesome, because God says to Moses, I'm going to kill all these people, and I'm going to start over again, and you're going to have new people, right? And Moses, what does Moses do? No, don't do that. You know?
They'll say bad things about you if you wipe everybody out.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to think about your reputation with the rest of the
I
planet.
know. Don't do that. People will say it. They'll talk.
Ugh.
And then what happens to Moses when he gets down and he sees them all fornicating and stuff?
Right. He's like,
I'm going to kill all these people. Of course, they did kill a bunch of them, but
Why
yeah.
would anybody be surprised that God relented or grace or whatever you want to call it? I mean, why else did he send Jonah there?
Yeah, and that's really awesome, because okay, so if you're okay, so think about who's reading this, right? So you're not a great nation. You know, the people that are reading this are not a great nation.
You've just come back from exile, right?
I mean, yeah, I mean, the people who are reading this, I mean, that's, so exile, destruction, you know, I mean, we don't understand that. We don't know what that means. I mean, we have moments like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. I mean, those are the moments that we can look to where somebody actually tried to attack us. And then what did we do? I mean, we just kicked everyone's ass, you know, and just destroyed everything, right? So, I mean, don't come and try that again. I mean, you know, we have that mentality, you know, like, you know, our life is a Toby Keith song. You're a Jewish person and you're reading this. That's not your narrative. I mean, your narrative is everyone comes in and beats us up.
Oh, you're trying to, why, God? Why did you do this? Why?
And then
Is the
God,
big question.
and then you get this thing,
Yeah.
which is, hey, by the way, those people that destroyed everything and flailed your relatives alive, yeah, their ancestors, I'm going to show them mercy. You know, it's like, WTF? Are you serious? You know, I mean, this is scandalous stuff, right? Yeah.
I guess I keep coming back to thinking that that's the history of the Old Testament is the Jews disobeying and ultimately being shown mercy.
Right.
And so here again we have people who've been, you know, more than disobedient, being shown mercy. So I don't know why, if you know your own history as Jewish, this would be that offensive.
So why would you
Although
think?
You said it bothered them less, but I was looking at Jonah. I think it bothered Jonah more when he's sitting outside the wall. It's bothering me personally. But,
Yeah. So, okay, so when we get into chapter 4, you start to see what's going on there, right? But so if you're Jewish and you're reading this, and you know your narrative is that we are chosen, we're the ones that get redemption,
yeah,
right?
You're right. 'Cause that
Yeah. So the lens is, you know, it doesn't happen to these people, right? The same way.
Even if they repent, even if they're, even if they show fear of God,
Right.
they don't get mercy.
So
That would be the less.
so the hint that you get at the beginning is the sailors of what happens when they're confronted with the event of God, that they believe and they fear the Lord, and they, you know, so there's like a hint of things going on that are not really, do you know what I mean? It's kind of, it's odd, yeah.
Maybe this is a hint of Gentiles.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. These are people that are not. So there's a really interesting midrash that when God was speaking on Mount Sinai, or was speaking, you know, that God spoke in 70 languages. Which is really interesting because when we start talking about Pentecost, then you have like some of that going on as well. So, but then God speaking on Sinai in 70 languages, but the only people that heeded the word of the Lord were the Jews. So the 70 represents the nations, right? There was this idea of the idea of 70 and the 70 nations. So it's like it doesn't happen to them, right? And so, but yet throughout the text, God has been telling him that's what you're there for. You're there to point to these names. You're supposed to do this, right? But yet they keep losing sight of that, their true calling. And that's what the Pharisees have done, right? The Pharisees, in Jesus' context, as he's railing against them, they are the people who have said, this is about us. Redemption is for us. We do this so that we will be redeemed and we will be restored and Israel will be put back on top. It's very nationalistic in its understanding. And so, you know, it's interesting that God is railing against the Jewish people in the Old Testament for doing that, and Jesus is railing against them in the New Testament for doing the same damn thing, right? And then, you know, everything gets broken apart at Pentecost, and suddenly everything has changed. So yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. Yep. You were gonna say something? Anybody else? But my hair looks really bad in this video. I was at the gym earlier and I was like, I had to fix dinner. I was running around. Hi.
I just wanted to mention that, being from Vietnam, my people got pretty beaten up for a long time. So I know that the part of the Christian that was in the Vietnamese, because it's very strong Catholic, the Vietnamese are Christian. And I was just looking through that lens, because that's how I grew up, and looking at God through that lens.
Right.
Like and so I'm always looking at God. I'm not sure if that's my ego, but I look from inside, from inside of me and how I connect with God. Through those experiences, I feel like those experiences gave me heart in my relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
And so the words there,
Yeah.
comes to me because I can relate.
So what you're describing then is there's a wonderful book that's called Reading the Scripture Through Western Eyes, which kind of speaks into what you're talking about, right? Because in the Western world, we have a particular way of reading the text that we read it from a triumphant kind of point of view, as opposed to people who have experienced being marginalized or their country being a war zone where imperial powers were sort of fighting it out, right? So all of those kinds of things. So if you want to make the connection, so the people of Israel were that place where the imperial, forces wanted that land. They wanted the location because it was a trade route. It was economic and all the rest of it. And so, they became a punching bag for every stinking empire that came along throughout the centuries, with very brief periods of respite, which they look back to with great. They long for the days, right, of David and of Solomon and of the Maccabees during that time period. So you think about all of the interesting sort of festivals that the Jewish people, they still hold on to, right? So Passover has to do with liberation from an imperial place in Egypt. There's Esther and Purim, the Feast of Purim, comes out of the time of Esther, which is a captivity sort of period. And then Hanukkah is from the Maccabean period, where, there's a miracle that occurs during. So it's interesting, that all of those sort of things come out of struggle and come out of those moments, but it all relates back to we are small and we are insignificant, but for God, right? And our goal, our purpose is to do something incredible, which is to point to that God. And so when they lose sight of that, then they need to be brought back, right? They need to be brought back into. So that's what Jonah is essentially telling them. And then, they have a choice. And so we're going to get to see how rotten Jonah gets in the next chapter. And he gets stinking rotten, right? So if you guys have read it already, So there's a whole thing. I'm going to cut it off now.